Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Caffeine Stream. My name is C.B. Robertson. This is episode 43. And I had mentioned that we'd be talking about simulation theory by Nick Bostrom. And because I have a special guest to talk with us about with some very interesting experience in sort of related fields, we might make this a simulation and artificial intelligence sort of free form conversation, kind of going all over the place. Sean Bradley, do you want to introduce yourself? You were an Army Ranger turned professional violinist turned surfer turned hobby computer AI spelunker. You're, at least in my own social media feed, you're one of the more interesting people to follow in the development of artificial intelligence in art and music and where all that's going. Did I summarize your biography more or less correctly?
Yeah, I think that kind of multi-hyphenate intro is very flattering. Yeah, a previous part of my life, I was in special ops, and then uh, and am continuing to work as a professional musician, but have also spent a great deal of my life as a consultant in the technology realm. I was a CTO of a startup in the Midwest for a while, and parlayed that career move into consulting across a variety of different industries, including briefly at a AI think tank for an oil discovery company in Houston, and continuing to tinker with AI as it gets increasing limelight with its more shocking and revelatory developments in the recent past.
Yeah, and setting demons to play music in your likeness on occasion, which is fun to watch.
Uh, yeah, I'm trying. I mean, because of my musical interest, I'm particularly watchful with regard to developments with in in music around how AI is impacting that. And it's shocking how fast that's happening. In fact, within the last probably 72 hours, I've seen things that have just really altered my whole my level of expectation about what's coming down the pike and the speed of which those things are happening. So
Wow, within
yeah,
the last
it's
72 hours?
in the last 72 hours. Yeah, I mean,
Jeez.
I think a few weeks ago I did a review of a product that's been rolled out by Google called Music LM, and shared some of the results of playing with that product among my musical friends, and they weren't particularly impressed. And I understand why they were skeptical that it might generate something meaningfully and qualitatively convincing as listenable. Um, but since that time, a couple companies have released just literally from that review of Music LM, which must have been, I don't know, like I said, maybe 3 weeks ago or something like that. Meta has rolled something out. Microsoft's Asia Research Group has rolled something out, and a team outside of Cambridge, Massachusetts, that includes folks from MIT and Harvard, have rolled something out where it's generating really like probably like 90% readiness for commercial consumption. I think to the degree people almost be willing to pay for the kind of output from these machines. So, and that, of course, has real sea change implications for the industry, for opportunity for musicians, for composers, arrangers, mixers, engineers, um, everybody in the whole delivery pipeline of music creation and preparation. So,
It is crazy how fast this stuff moves. I remember messing around with some AI art programs like 2 years ago, and with some friends and acquaintances, and be like, oh, this can make some interesting shapes. It can make some, this almost looks like a person vaguely, but not quite. Oh, it's a fun toy, but it's never going to amount to much. And then like a year later, it's putting out stuff that's like professional grade, higher quality than what 99% of people can do. Um, and but before we get into the simulation argument stuff, I wanted to ask you, um, as I follow Scott Adams, the Dilbert guy, and he's had an interesting take on AI and AI art, which is that our human interest in art um, is primarily sexual in nature. We're interested in what other people can create and what the art tells us about the artist. And so as soon as we find out that a painting is made by an engine, by an algorithm or a computer, we might admire how well it's done, but we'll lose all interest. We would never want to buy it, for example. Do you
That's
think
a very
something similar might be at work with music, or do you think that we'll just shoot by that? Or in your experience with the music, perhaps there might be different kinds of music, like the kinds of music people buy on an album, and then a different kind of music for movies or video games that people will accept AI for, but maybe not in other cases. Or um,
there's a lot to unpack there. There's the assertion that the creative impetus is driven by sexuality.
right,
Um,
or at least
and
our taste in
I'm
it.
not
Yeah.
sure if that's kind of the generative aspect of the artist's motivation, or the charismatic aspect of why somebody be compelled to pay attention to an artist,
Mm.
um, or maybe both. So there's something to explore in that assertion. It's not the first time I've heard that, and I think there may be some great truth to that. That there's um, both we're talking about creativity, right? The act of creation, and
Mm-hmm.
what drives humans to create, whether you're talking about creating um, an another one of themselves, or a combo of themselves and somebody else, or some
The
kind of proxy to that, right? So
the impulse to create, and also the impulse to buy or to experience something that someone else created.
there's a I think, like I said, I think there is a foundational fundamental kind of meta component to creativity that's driven by the same kind of energy, like that also drives like sex, for sure. It's not, like I said, I think that's a lot of very well-known creatives have kind of asserted as much, that it comes from the same place, the same kind of what's the word I'm looking for? It'll come to me, but the
But people talk about libido sometimes in a broader sense.
yeah, I don't even know if it's necessarily libido per se, but like just the um yeah, that fundamental creative energy. There's a root to that I think that may fork off to like actual like biological sex and creativity, and I don't think that division happens too far down the road of the human psyche from wherever that comes from. So
Mm-hmm.
um,
Right. Now, do you think people would be willing to buy AI art, though? Not create it, but buy it if they knew that it was created by artificial intelligence?
I think that's kind of a it's an interesting question, but I think that we've already seen that people are ready and willing to uh, manage their sexual impulses in a virtual environment. So whether they're
Oh, that's a good point.
having, yeah,
You think
I
of
think we've already
AI
trained. Yeah, humanity's
chatbots
already
and
been trained to. I mean, we've already, as bizarre and unbiological and just seemingly counterintuitive that it would be for people to get aroused by anything that's managed through a box. It's like that Woody Allen film where in the future, like people are basically like pleasuring themselves by playing with an orb or something.
you know,
So
when you put it that way, I suppose we should have known this back in the 80s when we first noticed hentai as a thing.
yeah, I don't know when hentai came out, but I do know that you know um, and I don't think it's just a male thing anymore either. I think there's just so much of our sexuality, especially among young people today, is being mitigated through a virtualized experience. Even the way they manage their relationships in a non-sexual way. I think some humans have even lost the ability to have a real flesh and blood experience with somebody, whether that's even just um, a friendly one or a sexual one, or a
Yeah.
familiar one or whatever.
The capacity to connect, emotionally with a machine is a strange and disturbing thing. And and that feels like a very nice segue into the simulation uh uh hypothesis, the simulation argument. If people are, having relationships, having sex, having friendships, exploring worlds in simulated environments, not just video games, but just conversations. Um, for anyone who might be listening to this who doesn't know, back in the late 90s or the early 2000s, it might have been like 2005, 2006, the Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom put out his simulation argument, which basically says, given the way technology is advancing, we will inevitably achieve lifelike simulation, what he calls ancestor simulations. So simulating what humanity might have been like at some point in the past, that are so lifelike that they are indistinguishable from real life. And it's only a matter of time and technology before that's achieved. And he said, in a world where those are possible, a theoretically infinite proliferation of these simulations could exist, because they're only limited by cyberspace. And so one of three things must be true. Either one, we destroy ourselves as a species before we achieve this point. Two, we magically, or for some reason, for whatever reason, we lose interest in ancestor simulations. Or three, given the mathematical odds that we are in the one objective real reality versus one of the innumerable, perhaps infinite, simulated realities, odds are overwhelmingly in the favor that we are presently living in an ancestor simulation. Now, people like Elon Musk and Scott Adams and a few others have picked this up and run with it and said, "Oh, we live in a simulation," and it's become a bit of a meme. And they talk about the bugs in the systems that it explains. And but from the math perspective, Bostrom himself says he's not sure which of those three is most likely, and he's dedicated a lot of his later studies and arguments to existential risk, on the assumption that maybe option one is more likely than we would like. And I mean, I wanted to talk with you in particular because I started posting some arguments against the simulation theory, and you came up with some very good, I thought, counter arguments to my arguments, at least with a few of them. And I thought it would be kind of fun to run through some of those. But I suppose I should ask you first, what are your thoughts on the simulation argument in general? Do you have a belief as to the likeliness of it, as to which of those three is most likely, or maybe his whole argument is flawed in some way?
I can't say that it's flawed. I mean, it seems on the surface um, potentially statistically um, possible. I don't want to say probable, but possible. Uh, Thinking about it induces a little bit of anxiety for me,
Yes.
and I try not to think about it and dwell on it too much, especially when there's like a weird confluence of things, that just seem when just perhaps serendipitously the world almost seems like this just feels like too much of a setup,
Yeah.
or this is somehow like I said, like just the confluence of certain, like, like the whole thing now, like aliens and, just like all these things that are, we've got AI like coming online right now. We've got just incredible computing power happening in the cloud. We have these proclamations now that in fact, oh, well, maybe aliens are real, and just so many weird things happening at once, and the speed of which these kind of milestones and thresholds in technology and civilization's evolution that we're just even 10, 20, 30 years ago, completely like just couldn't even imagine that would ever come to pass in your lifetime. Now are happening with such increasing rate and close proximity with one another on that timeline, and in a weirdly supportive way, where these things kind of like make sense that they would happen at the same time. Um, yeah, I find it very troubling almost. So I try not to go down too far the rabbit hole, but I find myself also many times throughout a course of a week saying like, Jesus, this is a simulation or something, and I don't want to construct my decision making and priority building around that thought, but um, the implications there for how you would manage your own life are kind of profound, or maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and that's I mean, the reason that Scott Adams, because I don't take anything Scott Adams says literally, at least at first brush, because he's a very tricky character. I think he's well intentioned, but he says directly that he likes to push the simulation theory because he thinks it helps people overcome their fear and anxiety, which is kind of counterintuitive. But he says, "Oh, if everything's a simulation, you can do anything,"
Yeah,
which was
just like
true.
damn it all to hell, it doesn't matter, right? Like
Yeah,
maybe it
and you
gives you
can,
sort of a bit of that
yeah,
stoic kind of
exactly. You can go ask that girl out. You can try to start that business because if you fail, oh, it's just a simulation, which is no actual change at all in terms of what you should do from if it was the real world. But for some reason, the idea, I think, is if people imagine it's a simulation, they become more risk tolerant about things that they just have psychological hangups about. I mean, you still don't want to go like, base jumping without a parachute or whatever high
I mean,
risk those kinds of things.
it
But
is a little bit nihilistic, perhaps, but
yes,
there's other modalities and philosophies of
Mhm.
thinking, or modalities of thought, or worldviews that might deliver as much utility in that regard. I mean, maybe reincarnation, uh, that we're in one iteration of a multiverse or whatever the case may be. It doesn't necessarily have to be a simulation per se, but simulation somehow seems like even, let's say that there's parallel universes or something like that. If we're talking about simulation, it could be in one of potentially an infinite number of simulations. That's not just a parallel universe. It's like a parallel non-universe. You know what I mean? It's like
yeah,
it
it
has no real, even less stake in the fact that it may be a thing. So
it
I
feels
don't know.
existentially dystopian in a way that I think
Yeah,
Baudrillard
and cheap.
probably,
It feels cheap almost, right?
yeah.
Like,
To me, it's interesting because it feels like the whole history of philosophy, going back, 2,500 years, is toying with these ideas of alternative levels of existence. I mean, back to Plato's cave, which I recently talked about recently, and I don't believe Plato believed the allegory of the cave in the way that a lot of Neoplatonists take it today. But people have been talking about this world is just a simulation, if you will, though, in 400 BC, simulation meant shadows from a fire on a wall with shadow puppets, and not computer code. But
I
Descartes
think
did
there's a
something similar with the
yeah.
evil demon.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just giving another example with Descartes and his evil demon thought experiment, where maybe my whole existence is just the construct of an evil demon that has deluded all of my senses, and I exist as, essentially, he didn't say brain in a vat, but brain in vat, or BIV for short in philosophy world, is the jargon to talk about that. And that again, it's like an idea that's very old in philosophy, and so it seems that the simulation argument is in some ways just kind of a new technologically updated iteration of this very old argument.
Right. I think it's just I mean, you can look at it that way, that it's just the latest abstraction of those same concepts, right? Whether you're talking about Plato's cave or the brain in a vat sort of thing. I mean, there's And there's other scientific views about what reality is and isn't. I think I mentioned to you in a previous conversation that, like Daniel Hoffman has this whole idea that reality is just that what we perceive as reality is just a sensory interface to what really is and is not.
Mhm.
And how we see the world is just an evolutionary adaptation of our sensory, mechanisms, these tools that we have. And so certain objects appear to be a certain thing to us because of the utility they present to us and not so much what they truly are.
Right.
Um, so that's, there's a whole lot. And I think I also mentioned this idea of the Boltzmann brain, where you could also assert in a universe of infinite, you know, particles like buzzing around, wavicles, whatever you want to call it, that some of them bump up together just in some statistically improbable but possible way. And in that instance, it constructs you and just for a nanosecond or less. And in that nanosecond, you have an experience that you think is individuated in consciousness and constructs a past history of memory and whatever, and then evaporates. And there's really no way for us to know if that's what's happening here or
Oh,
not. So,
sort of an unfalsifiable but plausible possibility of an infinite continuum of contiguous lifetimes of memory that are uh, bopping in and out of existence, and every one of them
right,
feels
yeah,
contiguous in the moment. Yeah, it's
yeah, it feels like there's a timeline, and it's just an instantaneous phenomenon that emerges and then sort of evaporates, and it might feel like, oh, I've been here for X amount of years and I know these kinds of people and we got these kind of, and that's just all just a happenstance of,
yeah.
just matter in the universe sort of formulating itself for a moment and then, reconfiguring into just nothingness. So
I
I
mean,
have no, and that's,
it's intriguing to think about. I think I mean, on its face, it's unfalsifiable, which doesn't mean it's not true. But I mean, against that, we have our own experience, which could be this thing that has popped into existence. Uh, but we have a set, I mean, that's what we have to work with. And if we all have a shared experience about something, it seems unlikely that we would all have the same experience bopping into existence at once. But that complex things take some time to build and to hold. And so if things are sort of appearing in the world spontaneously, contiguous histories with lifespan of history seems like an odd thing, a very counterintuitive thing to assume to be of the kind that could spontaneously sort of
I
combust
don't
into
know about
being.
that. I saw a very disturbing YouTube video of a guy in oh a video game engine, very popular. It was a demo for a video game engine like Real Engine or something. I can't remember the name of the product was, but he was basically a player inside this game, and he was interacting with a lot of NPCs, non-playable characters. I think that means.
Mm-hmm.
And he would walk up to the NPC, and which has been pre-programmed by somebody, and say to the NPC, did you know that you're an NPC? That this is a simulation. That it's not a
Mm-hmm.
real thing. That you're not real. And the NPC is like shocked. Like, no, that's very disturbing. Like, why are you telling me this? This can't be true. And
Yeah.
so that's complex. And I've seen. I think with regard to the whole AI thing, um, think about how hard it was to write a book 10 years ago or 20 years ago with a typewriter. And now you can literally, with just one sentence prompt, ask, one of these large language models to spit out an entire book. So that's a complex thing. Maybe it's not
Mm-hmm.
complex on the order of a life with multiple nodes in a social graph and an existence over this thing called time. It might not be as complex as that, but conceivably, I can imagine that a artificially intelligent agent could get to the point where it could create something as complex.
Yeah.
When I was at the conservatory, I was studying with a Pulitzer Prize winning teacher, composition teacher, and I was already interested in algorithmic composition at that time. And he was a traditional orchestral composer. And I asserted that in the near future, it would be possible to generate music algorithmically. And he both laughed in a disdainful way at the idea, and then also asserted with in no uncertain terms, he said, that's impossible. Music is way too complex. And this was just 23 years ago. And he said, it's too complex. You can't break something that complex down. And the older I get, the more I realize that there's not too many things in the universe that are too complex.
Well, and yeah, there's a really good distinction there, because complexity might be too low resolution of a term. Because I've messed around with a little bit with ChatGPT and writing, and it's kind of fun to mess with. It'll give you not what you want, so you tweak the prompt a little bit, and that gets you a little bit closer. And I've gotten it to say things by accident that I didn't want it to say. That was kind of funny. And it's especially fun to use to satirize things. My friend Jack Donovan started by writing an argument between two 23-year-old men. One's a bodybuilder and one's a strongman, arguing about which of their sports was better. And he had ChatGPT write this satirical dialogue to make fun of the debate in the broader culture, which is very funny. And like it can do these complex things, but as someone who is an okay writer for an amateur, but I can appreciate good writing. I enjoy, Haruki Murakami as much as the next guy. You read what ChatGPT puts out and you're like, okay, this is it's grammatically perfect. It can convey a point. If you ask it to summarize a book that existing summaries for it don't exist online, it can read the book, and the summary is going to be a little all over the place. I had it summarize, I think, one of de Maistre's works, and it got some of the keywords correct. It got the points completely wrong, like backwards in a few places. And so its comprehension was a little all over the place. And that's what you would expect with a large language model. It couldn't make or understand arguments exactly, but it could simulate arguments by copying, word patterns. And some people have asked, well, isn't that just what humans do, just at a higher level? Aren't humans just more complex versions of that? What word follows what? But there seems to be, at least in music and in art, a certain kind of, and you're right, complexity is not the right word because it can do extraordinarily complex things. But there's a spirit is not the right word. There's like a purpose, a purposefulness, or an intention that you can see in certain human behaviors that is sometimes you can see its absence in some of the things that ChatGPT will write. It will write and it will just kind of trail off into some weird digression that's technically grammatically correct and the paragraphs follow from each other, but you can sense, okay, it's losing the plot here. Perhaps that notion of that kind of purpose or intention might have been what your professor was getting at, do you think? Or do you think that's something that might be surmountable too?
I don't know if he was thinking that deeply, and I think I can give you from a musical background maybe a sense that might translate well to literature too. So, like when you've heard enough music, particularly in a particular genre, you don't even need to know if, say, somebody drops a new album, or you've heard most of Beethoven's, how to say the word, you've heard most of his repertoire, and you're listening to the radio and you hear a new work and you go, damn it, that sounds like Beethoven. And the DJ tells, oh, that was the Beethoven, string sextet number opus, whatever. You're like, oh, damn, I was right. Like certain artists, again, use music as a way to help me describe this. It will have a voice that's perceivable, and it's meta. It's beyond the actual material, on the surface of the of the thing that they're using to create with. So whether if it's sounds or it's words or it's clay or whatever the case may be, they will have something that comes through the art that's beyond the art itself, that makes you know who it is that made the art. That's an interesting thing. It's one of the things I love about music, is that it's kind of um, transgenerational uh, communication. It is a kind of time travel, and some art, you can say, is like that. Music, especially, because time is like the fabric of the thing itself. So there was a interesting engineer and music theorist, a guy named Manfred Clynes. He coined the term cyborg, actually. And he did an experiment with a lot of very famous musicians where he had them, these were in his era, I think it was like the 60s or 70s or something like that, where he had them sit down and listen to some music. And then he had on a chair, he had a tape that was pressure sensitive, and they could just tap on this tape. And if they listened to Beethoven, the beat that they tapped had a particular shape. It had a very kind of a bell curve, like inverted bell curve shape, with like a very deep, like a wide and deep bottom to it. Whereas if they were tapping to Mozart, it had a more kind of vertical sort of, shape to it, not quite as parabolic as the Beethoven beat. And he called this acentic form, and that essentially that the spirit of the composer, or the personality composer, whatever you wanted to call it, was evident in a holographic sense down to the level of beat. Now, beat is not an audible thing. It's a sensed thing. It's a periodicity that you can sense, and humans have a hard time sensing a beat if it happens less frequently than, say, about 5 seconds or so. But he's saying that the shape of this inaudible thing was being communicated through the music, and it was something very distinctive to that particular composer. So you might say that whether you're talking about just the pulse of something, or a particular melody, the way they fashion frequencies in a melodic way, or they fashion frequencies in a vertical harmonic way, the way they manage amplitude, any of the fundamental aspects of music, there's something meta about how that's communicated. And good composers have a voice, just like good writers have a voice. Something like, have you ever read like any James Elroy or something like that? I mean, just their use of language, it may not be, there may be somebody who kind of tries to do the same thing, but the way they do it, you can just crack a book open, you wouldn't even know what the cover, the title was. You go, that's exactly how this person writes.
Yeah.
And I think Chat GPT, when you ask it to do something, it doesn't have a voice yet, but it's not inconceivable that over time it could develop one if style became a business requirement of the actual tool's development.
Well,
and right now that's not the case.
I think this is actually a nice segue into one of the counter arguments that I was making to the simulation argument that Bostrom made, and that's the idea that simulations tend to degenerate over time.
That's true.
And I mean, it's interesting talking about voice, because I remember when Midjourney was first coming out, my friend Jack was messing around with different art styles, and he found he could very successfully say, paint this scene with this temple and the clouds in this way with this lighting, and paint it in the style of this artist, and it would do it, and it would do it very well. And if you could, in theory, if you could do what this gentleman you were talking about before was doing with the tapping, and finding this, basically graphing the deeper pulse of these great musicians, whether that's Mozart or Bach or Tool or whoever. I mean, if you could graph that, if you could quantify that, then a computer could replicate it. In theory.
That's right. And interesting to your friend with Midjourney, when I first saw Midjourney stuff, I said, this looks like shitty Frank Frazetta. Like, it just doesn't even.
It's probably because they were putting in Frazetta as a prompt.
Right. It's like everything kind of had this sort of vibe to it, this fantasy vibe of like half formed, mutated faces and not really. And this was like very honest. This is horrible. This is like anti art. And now I'm just blown away by the quality images coming out. And the prompting is definitely driven by providing everything from like, what f-stop of the camera to a particular aesthetic to this artist and this artist. And it was Picasso said that crummy artists borrow and great artists steal. And this machine is learning how to steal.
Yeah. Well,
and it's,
but
that's what SAG-AFTRA is on strike right now in LA. They're saying that, the whether you're talking about the face of an actor or their voice, they're afraid that the studios are going to use these machines to steal the very authentic form of who they are, and they won't be able to contribute any further. But you're right about how simulations degrade over time. I just read a recent research paper. I didn't actually read the paper in full, just sort of the summary of it. That was suggesting that if you like some of the ways you train these large language models is you can now use synthetic data. Basically, the machine spits out either the same machine or different machine spits out data, and then you feed it back in on itself. And if you do that too iteratively over time, it's sort of like incest, with genetics. It starts producing these monsters that don't really look good. And I had that experience myself training one of these online interfaces for a large language model with my own face. And for a while, it did pretty good, but every once in a while, I would spit something out that was just like horribly monstrous, like surreally bad version of a human face. And I'm certain it was this iterative process of feeding its own, like making it eat its own dog food. It over time, it wasn't working well. And the only way I could get around that is by periodically injecting actual photographs of myself rather than feeding it its own replications of my image. So that's an interesting.
Yeah.
Say again?
Fresh blood, so to speak.
Yeah, it needs fresh, human, real, this reality, base level reality interjection of data to keep that from happening at present. So
when you say at present, do you think there's a way it can throw in like a mutation rate to keep things from like fresh or in some way?
I think there's a way that it can QA itself. Yeah.
Yeah. Because and this argument, it's one of those ones I'm less certain about, but it's more of like here's a possibility that might mess with the probability that we would live in it, that we are guaranteed to live in a simulation. Because Bostrom's argument is a statistical one. He's saying it's given the inevitability of infinite proliferation of simulations or near infinite, it is therefore infinitely likely at some future point on the timeline, which would extend backwards into the past retroactively, that we live in one of these simulations. And so any thing that we can look at and say, this isn't maybe an impediment to simulations existing, but it might be an impediment to an infinite number of simulations existing. I don't think it's an impediment to
I don't think it's an impediment to an infinite number. It might be an impediment to an infinite number of very convincing simulations existing.
Well, that's the crucial.
We might just be lucky to be living in a decently, cogent and aesthetically pleasing simulation. There might be a simulation out there that's like a total hellscape because of this, degradation that happens when you start doing things at an infinite. And I think one of my arguments to you earlier was it doesn't necessarily have to be an infinite number of simulations. Like maybe a million simulations is enough, or 100,000 simulations is enough, where we might have this one or that one. I mean, it's like infinite's a big number.
I mean, and 1 in 100,000, we're talking like that's functionally infinite, as far as odds are concerned. But if we're talking 7, or like 12, really good, future simulations, I think given how corporate structures and competition works in the world today, it'd probably be more like 2 or 3, tops. There's the Meta one, there's the Amazon one, and there's the future like Standard Oil one or whatever business will
What
emerge.
makes you think that? How many SKUs does Amazon have for their products? Like, what makes you think that each of those corporations would only make one like foundational, like awesome simulation?
Um, I mean, my instinct would be networking effect.
What do you
And the
mean by that?
desire. Well, I mean, it's the reason why instead of a proliferation of hundreds of social media platforms, for example, um, we're sort of zeroing down. There's Twitter or like Prince, like the platform formerly known as Twitter, um, and the Facebook is I think still alive somewhere. If
Yes.
anyone's been on there recently, I don't know. There's Instagram. There's I hear from the kiddos these days that there's this thing called Snapchat. Um, and there are a few of these social media, and then I spend way too much time on YouTube, and now there's the world of podcasts. Um, but there's a competition that Highlander style seems to push for only one within any given kind of media domain. Like YouTube dominates the video world, and there always seems to be like one or two number twos, but there seems to like 80 to 90% of the market seems to be taken up by one or two, maybe three of these platforms. So on the economic
Right.
side, a proliferation of massive numbers seems uh, incongruent with our experience of competition in the market today.
Uh, I think it depends on the scope with which you examine this. If you examine this at the corporate like entity level, maybe so. But if you think of this as a product of a corporation, no, I can't tell you how many virtualized computers exist in any single Amazon server farm, but it's probably a shockingly huge number. The
That's
same,
true.
like when you're talking about digitization, digital products, there's just like
I
how
guess
many
there's no.
MP3s are there? How
I
many
guess
how
there's
many
no
movies are
limit.
there on
Yeah.
Netflix? Yeah, so it's very easy to replicate bits and bytes. It's not the same as replicating legal structures. And the consolidation and monopolization piece is probably more a function of capitalism rather than technology,
Right.
right? In terms of corporate. That's what's so crazy about the DAO thing. During the whole crypto phase, people were talking about DAOs, and DAOs are basically a uh, what is it called? Something of autonomous
Decentralized
organization,
autonomous
centralized
organizations.
autonomous organization. But a DAO could have been spun up programmatically. So it's conceivable that an AI that if you tasked an AI with creating a business and it used DAO as a fundamental legal entity with which it could execute businesses and manage transactions, it could they say that an entrepreneur, has to like basically burn through 10 businesses before he lands on, and this kind of arbitrary for different pundits, espouse different numbers, but it's very few entrepreneurs who arrived at great success with their very first business. And sometimes they have to fail a few times. That's why Facebook had as its motto, fail fast and fail often. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
that idea that you got to do it a lot of times before it takes 10,000 hours in order to play the violin or whatever the axiom is. It's seldom that you arrive at perfection on the first try. So what's frightening about the whole DAO thing is you could basically task an AI to like go learn about business and create a business and operate the business, and it could like just make a bazillion businesses in the blink of an eye. And if they fail, great. And one of them survives, like the egg of a squid in the ocean, then awesome. But damn it, who cares about the other 10 million that died?
Right.
So
Um,
um,
so
yeah.
that scaling issue and the interesting thing about scaling, which is something that another great philosopher, contemporary philosopher I love, has talked about with serious trepidation, Matthew Crawford, when it comes to the scale of these autonomous programs in appropriating our attention. But I think that scaling might you're good. might apply to, I'm trying to bring it back to one of the counter arguments, to the problem of energy, because these simulations, they take energy. We were just talking about cryptocurrency, and one of the complaints about Bitcoin in particular and other any proof of work type program is going to be energy, and how costing these things. Now, simulations are not tokens or currencies or securities or anything like that. However, the graphics and the sense data processing that you would be required to run one of these things at a believable resolution, you'd have to imagine would be fairly high. And I don't know how scalable that would be, but the energy requirements of such a simulation we would have to imagine be fairly high. And if we were going to have lots and lots of simulations, would the energy requirements of that could that be an impediment to the scale of numbers of simulations necessary for Bostrom's argument to be statistically plausible?
That's a worthy exploration, and I think that may hold water with the technological opportunities that we have on the table today. I just heard that, I had an interesting conversation with a microchip architect just a couple months ago, and he was interestingly one of the people, like some of these people that I speak with, the when I say that the trajectory of these things is frightening to me with music, and I suspect it'll become very frightening for a lot of other brain powered occupations. There's a lot of hubris. Like, humans are incredibly arrogant with regard to how, again, with the complexity piece, right? Like, I've had lawyers tell me, "Oh, AI will never be able to replace a lawyer," when AI has already passed the bar exam.
Law is the first thing that AI will replace.
Yeah, it's like, but they're like, AI will never be able to lawyer. Like, maybe it'll be able to do like paralegal research, but lawyers have to be creative with the way they manage strategy. Well, I'm telling you right now, there's startups that are focusing on training AI to be creative with strategy. There are doctors I've spoken to that are completely freaked out because the AI is excellent, like diagnostic, like it can like look at an X-ray and see things that a radiologist can't see. So I think everybody, accountants for sure, doctors, lawyers, accountants, anybody, writers, again, like the writers are freaking out in LA right now because they're afraid that AI is going to start generating scripts better than they can. So the degree that voice thing becomes really important, because I think I don't want to get away from the energy piece, but the voice thing is really the only thing right now that makes humans valuable in the style, the way they do something that's uniquely personal and individuated with how they execute a thing, is what they're contributing to these cultural artifacts right now. To the degree you do something that's templatizable, that is like just commercial, like standard kind of run of the mill stuff, it makes you more at risk for being replaced by one of these machines. But back to the energy piece. So this microchip architect I was telling him, are you he? I don't know if you've ever seen the way chips are designed, but you've got this silicon wafer, and these guys are basically going into a CAD like program and drawing in all the circuits. And it's like, some of these things have got like a billion circuits on like nothing, and the tolerances in manufacturing have gotten. We talk about Moore's law, like processing power doubles every 2 years, or whatever the case may be. Um, the tolerances to manufacture chips smaller and smaller, more and more and more circuits. We're like at the limit of that with physics, known physics presently. The thickness of some of these gates, some of these circuits within a microchip are literally on the order of atoms now. We're talking like 8 atoms thick or something. And silicon has a physical limit of, I can't remember how many nanometers that you can actually get things down to where it can actually control the circuit, control the flow of energy through it. And it also has these issues with heat so that I think, like even a small chip is generating, I don't know, 90 Fahrenheit, or I forget what the actual figures are, but the physics are limited by the size that we've gotten down to at the atomic level and by how much heat these things give off.
Well, and speaking
So
of heat, it's very interesting that we're talking about this on August 4th in 2023, because the big story in the news this very week has been the possibility, we're still trying to discern whether it's true or not, of discovering, supercomputing at room temperature.
right, right.
It
I
has
saw
been
that. Yeah,
claimed.
very fascinating, right?
It's
So
been
that's the
claimed.
kind of thing I'm talking about. We're already looking at different materials for chip manufacture, and also looking at different computing paradigms. I saw this that about that material that was like hovering at room temperature, superconductive at room temperature, and what that would mean for energy consumption if that is actually a replicable thing. Um, that would change the game with regard to energy consumption. But for instance, like the CEO of NVIDIA has already said that Moore's law is dead. That if we continue
Oh.
to operate in a silicon paradigm, that it's no longer, like we've already hit that limit. But there's people looking to use other materials and other ways of managing computation. And a computer is really just it's really no different than an abacus,
Have
right?
you do you read XKCD at all? It's just
No, I don't.
it's a
I don't.
web comic, and one of the most mind blowing web comics I remember reading was is a stick figure is out in the desert, and the comic strip is like a 12 or 15 you know image comic, and it's the premise is there's a guy who's stranded out in a desert on a totally isolated planet all by himself. And so, out of boredom, he decided to start arranging rocks, and he started moving rocks
Oh, I think
and
I've heard. Yes, and
simulated
they makes this like this supercomputer, right? Out
a
of the
simulated universe. It
rough,
just
right?
takes a very long
Dark, a
time.
dark, right? Right, yeah.
It's like
I,
it's
I
just
am
moving
familiar with that
rocks.
story.
But and the we were talking in the the problem of simulant degeneration about the scalability and how well we can with digital stuff we can replicate as many universes as we want or whatever. But with a regular computer, there is a limit to how many files it can store, because those files take up space. They take up um uh, room in the memory. So if you're storing simulations, entire worlds essentially, the energy problem I would have to imagine would scale or apply there, barring some massive breakthrough in not just silicon conductor power, um, but also in the infrastructure necessary to move it from whatever nuclear power plant or
It's
wherever
interesting
it's
you bring
stored.
up the storage piece because the CEO of Stable Diffusion said something that I heard on a podcast the other day that really struck me, kind of rattled me a little bit. He said that knowledge was compression. What's interesting about these large language models is what they are is really a compressed version of all of these. Like you can download a large language model and run it on your local machine if you got like a GPU. Some of these things we're talking about hundreds of megabytes or just a gigabyte or something like, or maybe 10 gigabytes. They're different sizes. They've got a trillion parameter models. They've got
That's
70
that's not that
million
much.
parameter models. Yeah. So, um, uh, like this particular CEO's vision is that basically everybody will have their own AI. That these can democratize this technology so that kids in the middle of the boondocks of some impoverished nation now have the the tools necessary to participate in the world of in a world being driven by AI. So
Hmm.
yeah, this idea that knowledge is compression was start like made sense, and it was a little shocking because it's a nice reduction of what knowledge is. But
It's
think
very
about it,
iterative
like
as a it's very iterative as a statement, isn't it? We're compressing
yeah,
our concept of knowledge into knowledge being compression. It's not a point
but
against it. It's just funny.
think about kind of like what it means to be smart as a human. I mean, there's ways different people define intelligence by, can you successfully complete a particular task? And there's got all sorts of benchmarks to measure the intelligence of AI, and it's how close it approximates human intelligence. Um, but when you think about what makes you smart, it's not like you have to recall in full a particular if then kind of else statement about how to behave. I see there. I've had enough experiences in my life that have been aggregated and stuffed in my cortex somehow that I something might feel right, and I don't have to necessarily unfold an algorithm like, well, is this variable true? This variable true? This variable, like some kind of Boolean expression of like 50 different variables lets me know that, oh, this is the right thing to do. It becomes compressed, like where I just like that feels right, and I just go for that particular action because wisdom tells me that that's going to be the best outcome. So
Yeah.
perhaps as we get older, we become wiser because what we've learned becomes compressed and almost intuitive. Like maybe the compression of knowledge is another way of saying intuition, or having heuristics that really aren't expressible, that are really compacting a lot into that heuristic. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
Oh,
stereotyping is a kind of compression as well, right?
yes.
Um,
Um, and
yeah.
that's an
So
interesting way to think about intelligence or being smart because I mean this is I think the premise of the Daniel Kahneman, the famous Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where there are some tasks that we need to sit down and really weigh our variables to calculate, and there's other things where we make split second decisions. Um,
right.
And I mean, you watch like a chess grandmaster play a chess game, and the first 12 moves will be they're taking 5 seconds a move, or maybe 2 minutes, and then they'll hit like the 17th move, and suddenly someone's sitting at the table for 80 minutes thinking, and then they make their move. And you're like, what was so complex there? You moved one pawn forward one spot. What was what was that all about? Um, and it does feel like you mentioned before, different people mean different things when they talk about intelligence, that there are different kinds of intelligence, and some are uh reproducible, and perhaps all of them are reproducible by artificial intelligence, by artificial means, but also maybe not, because we can already see it's very good at reproducing certain kinds of intelligence. But sort of going back to the music thing, there's a certain kind of like a spirit or a feeling to certain musicians, that an intention in certain writers that maybe it has a hard time replicating, and the the challenge of replicating that, I say that deeper. I don't know if that ties back to intelligence or not necessarily, but I've heard
Kind of.
intelligence defined as the ability to solve problems, and the ability to identify what is or is not a problem is itself a sort of prerequisite meta thinking capacity, that if a computer is not programmed to if it's identify if it's trained, I'm sorry, I'm getting mixed up here, if it's trained to solve problems but not necessarily to identify what is or is not a problem, um that might be some kind of deeper barrier that perhaps computer scientists and cognitive psychologists could work together to get around, but maybe perhaps not.
I think identifying problems is just another kind of task. I think going back to your statement about files and sizes of files, what I mentioned the
Oh,
compression thing is that files can be compressed. So, and what really becomes the bottleneck there is how rapidly you can compress and uncompress that reality or that simulation. So
okay.
I don't think that that's a I don't think file size is a philosophical uh, blocker for the potentiality to Bostrom's theory. I think that we'll
Okay.
find ways to address both the computational limits of silicon and the both the heat, uh, the creation of heat as a result of that computation, as well as the energy that computation requires. I know a gal is working for um, a, a fusion fusion energy company that's starting to get some traction. So there's other paradigms for producing electricity besides just nuclear power or coal, and those things are like people are actively working on that problem. So the energy consumption piece that might be solvable. The file size piece that can be potentially solvable. Um, there's an interesting just even within the LLM thing, very early on, there's this concept of shog tongue, where somebody was basically asking, these models, they have a context window, a maximum number of tokens they can handle before things really degrade. They can only keep so much of the conversation in their head. Um, and this is for humans too. Like this is one measure of intelligence. There's a guy, what's his name? I got to look up. Andy Kessler wrote a book called Eat People, and in it he proposes a couple different metrics for human intelligence that would include sort of like the like what a good programmer is. It's the speed of recall, the size of the data that can be recalled, like a chunk of data, like how big is that chunk, how many different basically threads of connection to other data can the person maintain in their head. So there's a variety of different metrics you can talk about, at least the way a programmer might be intelligent or a good programmer, but same thing for an artificial intelligence. And one of the things that I think is purposely being choked for the average person with regard to interacting with these LLMs, and I think especially as the government gets involved and sort of sees how powerful they are, is the context window. Is like how long can the conversation be before the AI forgets the beginning of the conversation? So
I'm
I
sorry.
think with chat
Were we talking about artificial intelligence?
with regard to
Sorry, very bad joke. Continue.
oh
Sorry, I couldn't
um,
resist.
um, right. So when ChatGPT first came out, it was like I don't know what the context window was like, less than 4,000 tokens, and now they've got like a version that can handle like 36,000 tokens. And there's Anthropic has come out with Claude, which is another large language model which can handle up to like 100,000 tokens. So the conversation can get longer, and the AI can reference earlier aspects of the conversation. And then there's workarounds with that, where basically you're pumping the conversation into a vector database so that it can then go dig around in the database for the beginning of the conversation. So, but when it first came out, there was this limit to how long the convo could be, and people wanted to be able to reference that conversation in a session a few days later, or whatever the case may be, and they would basically ask ChatGPT to compress the conversation for them, and it would, and it created this bizarre language. It basically created a new language that
Huh.
people that started doing this called shog tongue. It was it took your whole conversation and it reduced it to an alphanumeric kind of munged it up into this weird alphanumeric string that looked kind of like language but didn't. And you could take that blob of characters and then dump it into a new chat window and it would unpack it and remember the whole convo of words.
It's compression,
And I
like what you were saying
yeah,
before.
it was a compression of English into an alphanumeric representation, into a string of alphanumeric characters that it could uncompress and then remember the context. So it's like all of these words in sentences in natural language got chunked down into this weird blob of characters that you could then plop into a new window with a fresh context window, and it could kind of unpack that well enough that it would get the gist of what the previous conversation was. And I even went
Interesting.
further and I asked it to create sort of like there's actually human languages that are compressive, that a word, that compress things by nature. Like for instance, like Chinese. When you look at a Chinese character, um, whatever the word is for, let's say, you're looking at pictographs basically, and that can
Right.
mean a lot more than just the one character.
So you got to teach
I
it shog tongue with emojis.
Right, like so I asked it to, like, could I compress things further by using a different language, like a language that already has compression, like, so you've got, say, Chinese might have a character for the word nurse, and it's got X number of tick marks and circle, like lines through it. And if you extract some of those lines out of that kanji, or that pictogram, then the word for nurse becomes like the word for grandmother. And then you take another line off, and the word for grandmother inside, embedded in that, like a Russian doll, is the word for mother. And then you take another line out, embedded that is like the word for woman, or like the kanji for like employee, you take a couple marks off of that, or tick mark here off, or whatever. Then embedded within that's the word for slave. So it's like, so the language, they say, the Chinese say, if you speak Chinese, you are Chinese, because if you can really grok what those characters mean and speak them, within each character is like a whole etymology of their culture. And English is not like that, but there are other languages and there's even synthetic languages that compress things by nature. So I asked ChatGPT, I said, compress our conversation, and it did, and it made this weird shogtung thing. But I wanted to get it even smaller. I said, can you do it in Mandarin, and it would try to do something, and that was not so effective. But what I asked it to do that actually was effective is I said, okay, can you use shorthand like a stenographer would? So like shorthand has some a whole vocabulary which is represented like by one character. Like this character can mean 4 or 5 words, and so there's kind of a mapping from multiple words to just one character. And then I said, can you compress it further by making what's called a hash map, like a dictionary, where which is sort of the way databases work, where you're basically um, taking a symbol and, again, just associating that symbol to a longer string of things. And so between using some of the keywords in shorthand and creating a map or a key at the beginning of this compressed blob of characters, so you basically give it the decoder ring for the compression as the first part of the string, and then ask it to compress it with shorthand and this particular algorithm of compression that you've constructed through a hash map, and it could really get the blob of characters down to something small. So that's just within the context window of talking to the AI itself. I wholly expect, once you get AI speaking to other AI, that they will invent their own language, compressed language, where they can communicate massive amounts of information very quickly. It was Musk who said that the limitation of computers are slow with input and very fast with output. They can
Mm.
it they can output massive amounts of information very quickly, but they don't really have the sensory mechanism to ingest information as rapidly as humans. Humans, we have these senses, like the amount of things I can see and identify in my field of view, and hear and feel the ambient temperature, and the haptics of what I can feel with my skin and so forth. That's a lot of data. But
Right.
what humans struggle with is, so humans are fantastic with input and shitty with output. Um, but eventually, like as you see with these developments of robotics, with Boston Dynamics and a host of like even Tesla and other companies working with sort of marrying the large language model with robotics that have fundamental sensory capacity. Um, my fear is that eventually you're going to get different AI entities solving those throttles, in a way that just is going to blow away anything that humans can do.
Yeah.
So
Well,
So the problems that you're talking about with storage, energy, like, it's just a matter of time before we're leveraging AI to solve those, and it's just going to be
there's
like a whole nother thing.
creative ways of getting around that, perhaps. So it sounds like the simulation degeneration problem is probably solvable. The energy problem sounds almost certainly solvable. So there are two of the counter arguments. I have two more counter arguments, and one I think we'll skip over for time. And that's the problem of evil. And the idea is that all of the problems of our experience of evil, if one assumes a creator deity, as in Christianity or Islam or Judaism, could be cross-applied in the case of a simulation, because this is also a created universe. So whence cometh evil? And that too, as with Christianity and theologies, perhaps answerable. It's just one more of those interesting, how do we explain this if it is in fact most likely that we live in a simulation? So I just wanted to put my flag in that
I'll,
one.
I'll I'll speak to that very briefly. I don't know if you're
Mm.
familiar with C.S. Lewis.
Oh
He
yes.
wrote a sci-fi series called Paralandra, I think. I can't remember what it was a trilogy of books. Like a couple of
I've
there
I,
was
I've heard
Paralandra
of
is one
that.
of
I
them.
haven't read it, but I've heard
So
interesting things about it.
right. So I think one of the questions he answered is like, well, if there like he basically presupposes that there are other worlds where there's intelligent life.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that one of the questions that he kind of toys with in that series, if I recall, is well, how does that work? If there's intelligent life elsewhere, that doesn't work because then Christ would have had to go to more than one world to die for the sins of that world.
Mm-hmm.
And his answer to that was, well, that presupposes that those worlds had sin to begin with that needed dying for. You know what I mean? Like maybe those other worlds aren't evil, don't have evil in them, or somehow still maintain some kind of Eden-like innocence that doesn't require the crucifixion of Christ. So I don't know if that kind of provides a point of exploration for that particular counter argument to the simulation theory.
No, I think it does. It is an interesting idea. I had one friend suggest, well, you may think it would be better to create a world without evil, but remember, Nick Bostrom is talking about ancestor simulations. So if a human wants to
Right.
simulate the past, why would he want to simulate the past without the suffering that comes along with the past? And I thought that was actually a fairly decent counter argument, or at least a possibility. Again, these are all sort of probabilistic arguments. None of these are necessarily knockdowns, but really arguments in the very early stages of formulation. You see with Christian apologetics and theology, an argument that is straight up bad, um, in its early form. I'm thinking in particular of St. Anselm's ontological argument. It's just awful. And then over the course of 1,000 years, it gets developed and developed and developed, and suddenly you have modern modal logic forms of this that are like, Jesus, that's actually pretty compelling, and it takes serious firepower to take it down. So AI and this simulation argument are so new. We're still in the sort of exploration stage of what would the counter arguments for this be. And I think the energy problem, there might be something to it. I thought it was interesting, but I think you've presented some pretty good contrary probabilities, not even possibilities, probabilities.
I don't
Uh,
know. I can't speak to the probability. I can say that some of the things I've said might be possible. Who's
mm,
to say what the probability are? But
certainly. I mean, this is all sort of intuition and seeing, yeah, what seems most likely in our head based on the knowledge we have now, which will likely be very different in 5 years. Um, but the last one, which doesn't seem as different, and we sort of touched on it earlier on, thematically, but the last counter argument is option two. Nick Bostrom talks about the possibility that we might lose interest in ancestor simulations. And given the effect that we now know with increasing certainty and clarity, um, of internet use and screen time and these simulations on our mental health, um, do you think not only, we were talking before about how, is if art is sexual, well, that hasn't been an impediment to having conversations with digital beings. But perhaps if we understand in the abstract that this is a danger in simulation, could we perhaps even employ artificial intelligence to our own benefit in helping us off of this simulation track? Will
well,
we?
already they're talking about one of the biggest concerns I think that people in the AI community have right now is, of course, the weaponization of AI in some frightening way. And I think one of the things that I've heard some just I heard a conversation that one of the concerns is, like, for instance, using AI to construct, weapons of mass destruction, like biological weapons, that you could basically enable, some dude in your neighborhood to make the next super virus and wipe out half of humanity with it. And so safeguarding against that and building in alignment with our survival is a concern among some of the bigger foundation model founders and so forth. And I think it was Mark Andreessen who was saying that uh, these things that we're afraid that AI could do, like whether it's to hijack our attention totally and just like hypnotize us as a society, or build, some kind of horrible weapon, or whatever the case may be, that's super frightening as a potentiality of AI sort of becoming super intelligent and, playing with us like puppets, or regarding us like ants, or whatever, the nightmare is to build another AI that would guard for that. In other words, using AI to protect us from AI. I think that's a little recursive. Um,
Well, it literally is. Yeah.
yeah. So, but whether it's think about your spam filter as a kind of AI, right? So for your email, it's really just an algorithmic thing, and it's kind of a early form of AI that keeps spam out of your inbox and dumps it into the spam folder of your Gmail or whatever. So we're already sort of doing that. Um, I wish we had I'm a little upset that we don't have something like that with regard to like social media use or Instagram or Facebook. I find that I feel like I'm already on my phone too much. And a lot of people, thinking people that are relatively disciplined, struggle with that. And uh, I think my fear is that I could see, I could see us being boiled like frogs into sort of some kind of relationship with a box or a phone or a silicon entity that yeah, it's frightening how our behavior has been modified. I mean, I think that was really profoundly clear to a lot of people during the pandemic, how easy it was to tilt a whole segment of society towards one kind of behavior or another.
So you
Um,
could almost say, the concern about whether or not we're living in a simulation of the real world might be a moot point if you live in the one real objective reality, but your eyes are always in various low resolution simulations on your phone. and
Yeah,
that's
no,
more of
100.
a
That's exactly. I mean, think about how easy it would be to like given like had the power that social media had to proliferate opinion and to modulate human behavior. That how those algorithms uh, incited our behavior because of what they were presenting to us over and over and over again. Whether you were pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine, we were constantly getting our chain jerked through these machines that were always around us,
these
and it
interfaces. Yeah.
modified our behavior dramatically. Like some people, to the degree I still see people today in their car alone wearing masks. And there's no reason for anybody to need to mask up in a sealed environment by themselves,
Yeah.
hurtling down the freeway. But the behavior was so deeply ingrained in them over that time period that it's hard to undo it.
They're programmed.
Um,
And we're all programmed. Every single one
we're
of
all kind
us.
of we've all got this wetware that's highly programmable. Humans, I even before the whole AI thing emerged, one thing that I spent a lot of time thinking about is how prone we are to repeat certain actions. It's like that's somehow our biology, the very structure of our brain and our biology is set up in such a way that we have a proclivity towards repetition. And once a behavior is ingrained, it's like Pavlovian, like we can hardly help ourselves.
Oh yeah.
This is like how addiction works and all kinds of things. So, um, they say that like each day we, 80% of the things we think we thought the day before. We are repeaters, and it would be very easy, given that proclivity of our wetware, for some external agent to sort of channel us into a direction little by little by little, like I said, like boiling us like frogs. We're like, okay, there's something to be very worried about. Don't go outside. Stay inside. Okay, I'm staying inside. And now, you really shouldn't go into the same room that grandma's in because that can really hurt you. And then before you know it, you're like sitting in the same chair over again. And then before you know it, you're just basically in a pod like Neo. You know what I mean? In the
Yeah.
Matrix. So it'd be very easy to corral people into a particular behavior where maybe your energy dilemma is solved in a very dystopian matrix like way by this machine itself.
Yeah.
So I'm very worried about having my behavior modified and just inched and edged ever more towards something that isn't really best for me. And I think that's happening already in large scale across humanity. So, and kind of lost the thread of uh, your
Well,
fourth argument there. Maybe.
it was the idea that perhaps the most likely of the three possibilities, self-destruction of the species, or we're living in the simulation, or we lose interest in ancestor simulations prior to
Right.
getting there. Um, maybe our interest is not relevant if our behavior is being hacked in this way. But it occurred to me as you were describing this aesthetically, from a video game designer's perspective or a simulation builder's perspective, it would be a very lame simulation to create a world in which everyone is living but is constantly being distracted by an iterative secondary simulation within the first simulation. There's something unartistic about that that seems
I don't know. I mean, I'm artistic to a human mind, maybe, but maybe not to a machine.
maybe this is some kind of MC Escher thing. Well, I suppose if machines are the ones that are creating the simulations, and that would be very interesting. A decentralized
Yeah.
simulation generator from an algorithm. It's kind of wild to contemplate.
Yeah.
I
I mean,
like to
like just,
imagine a human would be behind these simulations, but I suppose it isn't
it doesn't
necessarily
have
have to
to
be the
be.
case. Yeah.
The things that are values, about what is emotion to us versus what is emotion to a machine. People are already arguing about whether or not these things are sentient. Like are they already intelligent? Are they already conscious? And what is consciousness? Or do they emote?
Yeah.
Do we have a
And
responsibility to them because they emote? Well, maybe the way they emote isn't the same way humans do.
and I guess
You know,
what a machine would consider a believable simulation might have different metrics than what a human would
right?
consider a believable simulation to be.
What lights our fire and triggers us and it entertains us may be radically different to a silicon mind, to a machine. So I
Yeah.
don't know,
Well, we've
but
been going for about an hour and a half.
yeah.
I gave my four arguments, and I feel like you actually shot them down pretty
Well, my
successfully.
intent wasn't to shoot them down. I think
I mean that
they're
as a
all worthy
compliment.
arguments.
I mean that as a compliment. And because all arguments in philosophy have counter arguments, and you try to make them as strong as you can. And it is such just an interesting field. And I really appreciate you coming on to chat about this, because it is
Quite
interesting
delightful.
hearing your perspective on this. And it makes me want to go back and try to strengthen those arguments a little bit, because I do like to imagine that I live in the real world. um
I do too.
and that's
Very much
and
want to live in the real world.
the
Yeah.
supposed, the purported history of philosophy of all of these other worlds that are more real than the real world, or whatnot. um if that history is real and not just popping into our memory by a program, uh inclines me to believe that this is just one more iteration of a long line. But it's a fun thing to think about, and if nothing else, a mind exercise. And who knows, perhaps we can come up with a better way to live in our simulated lives by thinking about it.
I hope so. Yeah. Thank you. Very delightful convo.
Thanks so much for chatting, Sean.